Joining me now from Winnipeg, James Bezan is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Defence. Here in studio with me is Jack Harris, the NDP Defence critic. And in Toronto tonight, Chrystia Freeland, the Liberal trade critic. Thanks to you all for coming in and talking about this. Interesting interview with Justin Trudeau yesterday, which I want to ask you about. As you know, he declared that if elected, he would pull Canada's fighters, the CF-18s, out of the bombing mission in Iraq and Syria. And he had some harsh words for the government. Take a look what he said.
The Canadian military has things that it can and should be doing to train. And
but just not bombing.
Not a combat role,
it's staying out of combat and staying far away from the front lines.
I think 10 years ago, we learned through the first Iraq War what happens when Western troops get involved in combat, and they don't necessarily, whether it's Libya or whether it's Iraq, it doesn't necessarily lead to the kinds of outcomes people would responsibly like to see. And what I've committed to staying away from is the kind of easy solutions in a very complex area that this government has specialized.
And before we go further, I just wanted you to take note also of the other side of the story from Minister of National Defence Jason Kenney, who took time out to share some tweets, a lot of tweets, on what the Liberal leader said on this program yesterday. Here's one of them. Trudeau apparently believes the US-led air campaign supported by 24 allies is an easy solution from which Canada alone should withdraw. He says we can contribute more to the fight against ISIL's campaign of genocidal terror by ending airstrikes. End of quote from Jason Kenney. So, James Bezan, what do you make of Mr. Trudeau's comments and the response from Mr. Kenney?
Well, I think Mr. Trudeau's comments to come out of all days on the National Day of Remembrance for the victims of communism and terrorism to come out and denounce that they would not, that the Liberal government would not be participating in the fight against jihadi terrorists in Iraq and Syria is beyond disappointing. And it just shows again that here's an individual that tries to minimize the reality or is completely naive and doesn't understand the consequences of his words and potential actions in this very serious situation. You got to remember also yesterday, Terry, is ISIS put out another series of videos demonstrating how they have brutalized and killed and murdered their prisoners. And it is, you know, in most cases it's religious minorities, it's ethnic minorities that they're persecuting and executing in despicable ways. And Justin callously comes out and makes these comments, which I think are inexcusable.
Okay, in fairness, though, he didn't say what you just said. He didn't say that Canada shouldn't participate. Well, in fact, he said that he would consider sending more trainers than your government has sent.
Look, we already see the Kurd, Peshmerga, and other Iraqi security forces starting to again have some impacts in a positive way in the fight against ISIS. And the only way they are going to be successful against ISIS is to have air support. And that's why we're there in a combat mission with our CF-18s, not the CF-15s that Justin called them yesterday, but the CF-18s, because that is the way that we can support the coalition and support the ground troops, including the Peshmerga and Iraqi security forces, in taking an effective fight against the jihadi terrorists. And so if we're going to be serious about protecting Canada, about taking the fight to ISIS, we have to be there in a combat role as well as doing the training, which we're doing so well with our special operation forces stationed in Arbel.
I can see Chrystia Freeland champing at the bit to get in here. You might as well just go, Chrystia. What do you say to what Mr. Bezan has said now?
Well, thank you very much, Terry. Look, I just would really endorse your follow-up question. The position that Justin Trudeau took in that conversation is what has been the consistent position of the Liberal Party on this issue. We absolutely believe in and support the fight against ISIS. How could someone not? Hang on, James, wait a minute. I didn't interrupt you. I patiently listened, so please pay me the same respect, okay? So we absolutely support the fight against ISIS. Everyone in Canada does. We understand that this is a terrorist organization. What we also believe and understand, and this is the lesson of history, as Trudeau said, it's the lesson of Afghanistan and Iraq, is that this fight will be won when local forces engage and fight and defeat ISIS. What is happening there is the equivalent of the 17th century 30 Years' War in Europe. This is a fight about modernity, and we need to support the progressive forces. The best way we can do that is through our excellent training support. As Trudeau said, we are very open to expanding that. And the other thing that we need to do, and it is shocking to me given the high rhetoric from this government that we are not, is stronger humanitarian support and stronger support for refugees. We have said there should be 25,000 government-sponsored refugees from Syria welcome to this country, as we did with Hungarians in '56, as we did with the Vietnamese boat people. That is the way we win over hearts and minds in that region and ultimately have a successful result.
Jack Harris, your party opposes the mission in Iraq. Do you agree with the Liberals on this?
Well, look, the last thing that Mr. Trudeau and the Liberals have been on this is consistent, despite what Chrystia Freeland just said. You know, back in September, Mr. Trudeau was saying he would support the notion of airstrikes in Iraq, and then he and his party voted against the motion in the House of Commons. When the motion was passed for the extension, the defence critic Joyce Murray was very clear that once the decision was made by Parliament, we would continue to support the operations in Iraq, and that included past the next election. So now we've got a new position from Mr. Trudeau, trying to really have it both ways, and committing to an enlargement of troops on the ground, unknown number, for an unknown period of time.
Pulling the fighters out, you'd agree with, wouldn't you?
Well, we agree.
You oppose that?
We would end the mission. But what I was talking about here is Mr. Trudeau's leadership on this and the flip-flopping and equivocation that's been going on for some time. We've said from the beginning we don't support this mission. It's not a NATO mission. It's not a United Nations mission. It's something that were being done without that backing, and in an area where we don't have any expertise, and there's a increasing understanding that what's happening there on the ground includes the Iranian involvement, the Kurdish effort to get a state, and all sorts of evidence that there's no solution with the way that things are going right now.
Terry, can I just come in, because my leader's position has just been challenged. So it is absolutely not the case that our position has been inconsistent. It has been absolutely consistent. And when it comes to the fighters, there is a very clear difference, however, between us and the NDP.
All right,
we are very clear.
I can give you a quote.
Again, guys, gentlemen,
Look, I can give you a quote from Joyce Murray from March the 24th, 2 months ago.
Jack, I did not interrupt you. Please don't interrupt me.
You're just contradicting. That's all you're doing.
No, you're interrupting me. And I would like to say today was my youngest child's kindergarten graduation, and those kids are taught to behave more politely than you guys have been on this show.
Okay.
Really, let a person finish talking. No, seriously.
We're
and just
adults
on
here.
that. No, Jack, on the combat mission, the clear difference between us and the NDP, exactly as my colleague Joyce Murray said, is we accept that this is a decision the Canadian government has taken, and we are cooperating with our allies. Our shift in position, were we to form government, would be reasonable in collaboration with our allies. There would be no sudden change.
All right.
And that is the reasonable adult position.
Chrystia Freeland, if I may, rather than a discussion about who's been consistent or not, I'd like to focus just one more question, if I may, on the substance of the issue and put it to James Bezan that these airstrikes haven't been particularly effective. We're reading today, for example, that all the headquarters of ISIS in Raqqa in northern Syria are untouched by the airstrikes. The roads are clear, the convoys are traveling. 75% of all the coalition airstrikes don't happen. They come back with their bombs undropped because of the fear of civilian casualties. If the airstrikes are not effective, and let's face it, a lot of the airstrikes have been about Ramadi, and oh, what happened? ISIS took Ramadi. Well, then why continue them?
And then yesterday we had very effective airstrikes carried out by the U.S. coalition just north of Raqqa, as well as just outside of Tikrit, and actually ground was made up by coalition fighters on the ground to take back territory that ISIS had. Air support is key to this, definitely in the rules of engagement. The pilots have last decision on whether or not they drop their weapons, because they don't want to have any civilian casualties, and I think that's a good thing. I think Canadians would agree that's a good thing. And if they come home carrying firing their bombs because of their concern about civilian casualties and collateral damage. I think that is something that we would support. But we are still being very effective. There is the strikes that are going out there, and we are gaining territory back. And again, this just proves that Justin Trudeau is out of touch and is not ready for the job of making serious policy decisions. And you know, Jack mentioned the issue of Iran, and we heard yesterday from Justin Trudeau that he wants to again normalize relationships on a diplomatic level with Iran. I don't think that Erwin Kotler, who with me founded the Canadian Parliamentarians for Human Rights and Democracy in Iran, would agree with that statement, because we have a leader there right now in President Rouhani who has actually increased the amount of persecutions and executions of political prisoners and religious and ethnic minorities above even what Ahmadinejad did. So, you know, here's an individual that just doesn't seem to get what real world affairs are all about.
I want to get a response to your remarks about Iran, because we should have, if you don't mind being brief on this. Re-establishing relations, Jack Harris, what's wrong with that?
Well, first of all, let me say about Iran, you know, this is the first statement that we've heard from Mr. Trudeau about Iran. He had nothing to say when he said he wasn't going to second guess the Canadian government when they pulled out, but since then said nothing. We were very supportive of the notion that there was negotiations going on that Canada was not a part of to try and end the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And our position would be that, look, some progress is being made. We'd monitor that. We'd want to see whether there was a point in re-engaging with Iran. But we would want to see progress on that, because diplomatic relations is a way to influence what goes on.
So you
inside
agree with Mr. Trudeau that we should re-establish those relations? Potentially,
when we see what progress is being made on the nuclear front, to see whether
you're not taking a position.
Well,
potentially, maybe.
Well, yes, but it's not something yes or no. I mean, he's saying yes without any reason. Yes, we should reopen. I'm saying we should re-engage. We should re-engage with Iran. Whether that involves open diplomatic relations immediately is another question. Obviously, these are questions that have to be evaluated at the time. Mr. Trudeau jumps in on this, say, "Oh, we're going to do this." He wants to show. I think he wants to show that he's somehow decisive about this and has a position. There's nothing behind that.
All right, Christy Freeland, as I understand it, you tell me briefly if I'm right or wrong. The position of the Liberals is re-establish relations if there's a nuclear deal. Is that right?
Yes, and also subject to what Iran is doing on human rights. You know, in fact, Erwin Kotler, who I am proud... Gentlemen, don't interrupt. Erwin Kotler, who I am proud to have as my colleague, has been a leading critic of the human rights abuses, and that is very central to the Liberal platform. So, absolutely, I think Justin Trudeau's position on Iran is absolutely consistent with what we've been saying, and it's the reasonable position.
James Bezan, quick last word to you, if you will. What's wrong with re-establishing diplomatic relations with Iran?
Subject to a nuclear deal.
It's not just subject to a nuclear deal, because in the own press back in Tehran that I've been reading, they're still saying that they are not giving up their nuclear program, that they can ramp up 95% of their centrifuges in a matter of 3 months if this deal falls through, and that there's no deal actually signed in place yet. And so they actually have been bragging about it. And let's not forget that it's Iran that is a state sponsor of terrorism, that they believe the state of Israel should be pushed into the Mediterranean Sea, and at the same time is still persecuting many of its political adversaries, as well as ethnic and religious minorities within the country itself.
I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you all for coming in and doing this. Appreciate it very much. James Bezan, of course, is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Defence. Here in studio, Jack Harris, the NDP defence critic, and in Toronto tonight, Chrystia Freeland, the Liberal trade critic. Thanks to you all for being here. Appreciate it.
Great to be with you, Terry.
Thanks.
Thanks, Terry.